Our theme this term is Waging Grace, as we've been considering how we can respond to the conflicts in our community, in our nation, and in the wider world. And in Christian theology, grace literally means God's undeserved favor, God's free gift to us, his free gift of forgiveness, because when Jesus died on the cross, he took the death penalty that you and I deserve for everything wrong we've ever done, so we can be forgiven. That's a free gift of grace, but it doesn't stop there. He calls us then to live it out through living a life of grace, of graciousness in the way in which we deal with other people and live in this world. But how do we do that? What does that mean practically for us? That's fine words, but practically, what does that mean? In this passage, which is a familiar passage, I'm going to look at 3 examples in Jesus' actions and see how we might apply those principles in our lives today. So we're going to look at the grace that reveals as Jesus prepares to enter into Jerusalem. We'll look at the grace that feels as Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. And then we'll look at the grace that heals as Jesus clears the temple. So a grace that reveals, feels, and heals. And now I am feeling like a nonconformist preacher, because it's always in 3. When I first became a Christian, I attended a nonconformist church. It's okay. You don't have to be Anglican to get into heaven. But why take the risk? No, but I went to a nonconformist church, and I'd just come to faith, and I assumed that the Bible must be all written in a series of 3 points, all beginning with the same letter, because every sermon I heard was. But anyway, this might be helpful. So a grace that reveals, a grace that feels, and a grace that heals. And we'll look at those, and we'll pause in between to give a moment to reflect and think ourselves and apply it in our own lives. And Rhiannon will come and when I'm doing a moment of reflection, just play a bit of quiet music for us. So let's start with the beginning of the passage, the grace that reveals, as Jesus prepares to ride into Jerusalem. So Luke 19, verse 29, as he approached Bethpage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you. As you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here." This is not just an arrival scene. The words and actions of Jesus have great meaning. Everything communicates meaning. It's not just an arrival, it's a revelation. He asks his disciples to bring him a colt, the C-O-L-T, that is. The word that's used in the original Greek is the word polos, which can mean a young horse or a young donkey, but we know from Matthew's account that actually it's a donkey. And that's highly symbolic, because in that culture at that time, kings rode on horses, big, strong, adult horses that symbolized warfare and conquest and power. And Jesus is showing that he's a different type of king. Donkeys were associated with peace and humility and service. Jesus is not an oppressive king of war. He's a liberating king of peace and humility and service. Now, many of us might be familiar with that, but we may not realize the significance of the other thing that Jesus said there. It's a donkey, a colt that has never before been ridden. That was also highly symbolic. At that culture at that time, animals that were used for sacred purposes were set apart, consecrated for special use. They weren't used in the ordinary day-to-day life. So Jesus is not just borrowing transport, he's staging a revelation. As he rides into Jerusalem on that donkey that has never before been ridden, set apart for a holy purpose, he's echoing back to the words of the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 9 says, "See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So here Jesus demonstrates a grace that reveals that he is the promised king, but a king that brings peace, not riding on an impressive war horse, but on a small donkey. He's fulfilling the scriptural prophecies. Not a military leader, but a suffering servant come to die for the forgiveness of the world. He brings reconciliation, not revolution. He is king, but he reveals it not with trumpets or fanfares, but in quietness and humility and service. How can we follow that example in our lives? Practically, what difference will that make in our lives? Of course, we are not the promised king, are we? We can't follow that example, but we do have God-given gifts and abilities. Each one of us has God-given gifts and abilities. How do we offer those? Do we offer those in quietness and humility, or do we want to trumpet them to other people? Do we want to see them received with fanfares, or at least be recognized and respected by other people? Let me tell you a story I haven't told before this morning. I told it at the 9 o'clock. As I'm kind of learning more how to adjust to life as my ministry life or closes in. As you get older, all sorts of things in life close in. So I'm going to tell you a story of something that happened to me at the turn of the millennium. Something I'm not proud of at all, but from which God taught me a lot. Back at the turn of the millennium, I was invited to speak at a conference in Thessaloniki in Greece, a conference attended by Christian broadcasters and Christian filmmakers from all over the world. And they asked me to do the keynote speech, the opening speech at the beginning of the conference. And the night before the conference started, the attendees gathered for an informal dinner, because we're people from all over the world. We didn't know each other. And I was sat on a table with a particularly loud and opinionated man. He was American. I don't know whether that has anything to do with it, but he was particularly loud and opinionated. And as he spouted his opinions, I tried gently just to kind of question them, but he constantly shut me down and spoke over me. He treated me as if I didn't have anything useful to say. I'm rather ashamed to say that the next morning, when I was introduced as the keynote speaker, I did get a rather selfish pleasure from thinking of him squirming in his seat in the audience, and indeed later when he came up to me to apologize for the way he treated me. And afterwards, God really challenged me about that selfish pleasure what I got. I'd enjoyed being recognized and respected, particularly in the face of somebody who'd rejected and belittled me. And God challenged me about that attitude. Why did I need respect and recognition from other people? I was there to serve God. I wasn't there for respect and recognition. Why did I feel I needed? How would I have felt if I wasn't the keynote speaker? Indeed, if I wasn't a speaker at all, if I'd had no opportunity to vindicate myself. In subsequent years, particularly as I've got older and spoken at fewer and fewer events, I've had to learn that God values me for who I am, not for what I do. And particularly that I don't need to be recognized and respected. And that isn't easy. It's not easy for any of us. So I invite you to consider, as we look at the example of Jesus going in humility and quietness and service, how do you feel about your value? Perhaps, like me, as you're getting older and your life closes in, and or if you're younger and you're feeling, I get overlooked and not respected at work. People don't recognize my quality and my ability at work or in school or in the family or in the community. We follow Jesus, who was rejected and despised by men, who could have come charging into Jerusalem on a war horse, but chose instead to sit on a donkey in quietness and humility and service. If you feel overlooked and not respected, know that in God's eyes, you are enough. God sees you. God sees your quiet service, even if no one else does. God values you for who you are, even if no one else does. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on this. Just reflect in your own mind. Do you know that in God's eyes you are enough? Do you know that God sees you and values you even if no one else does?
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Now, after this grace that reveals, we see the grace that feels. Verse 41, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. Why was Jesus weeping for Jerusalem? Because he knows what will happen to it. We see there, verse 43, 44, he says, the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. Talks about destruction of Jerusalem. And within a generation of Jesus speaking those words, Jerusalem was devastated by the Romans. Roman armies led by Titus, the son of the Emperor Vespasian, laid siege to the city, surrounded it, besieged it. Escape became impossible. The people starved. Then the Romans breached the walls, burned down the city, and destroyed the temple. And Jesus knows that this is going to happen, and he knows that people are going to reject him and his message of peace, and it will be followed by war and destruction, and he weeps. He weeps even though he knows that his rejection and death will provide a means of forgiveness and restoration for humanity. Even though he knows that when he dies on the cross, he will take upon himself the sin of the world so that we can all be forgiven and restored. The grace that feels, which we see in Jesus, empathizes with our human condition, our pain right now, even though we know that things will be put right in the future in heaven. Yet we feel the pain right now. So I invite you to think about, how do you react when you feel sad, which we all do at various times. Perhaps you feel sad because of your health or your finances. Perhaps you weep over your family or over this community, over this nation. Do you then feel guilty for feeling sad? Do you beat yourself up because you think you ought to be happy? Aren't Christians supposed to be happy all the time? Because we know that ultimately God will put everything right in heaven. It's okay to feel sad due to the pain we experience right now. It's okay to weep about our current situation. We're in good company. Jesus wept. Jesus weeping over Jerusalem echoes another occasion when his friend Lazarus had died, and Lazarus' sister Mary was so upset. In John chapter 11, it records, when Jesus saw her, that is Mary, weeping, and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? Meaning Lazarus. Come and see, they said. Jesus wept. Jesus wept even though he knew he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. When Lazarus died, Jesus stood with his family and cried. He knew Lazarus had died before he'd even got there, but still he cried. He knew Lazarus would be alive again in moments, but still he cried. He knew that death was not forever. Jesus knew eternity and God's promise of new life better than anyone else could. Yet he wept because this world is full of pain and loss. He wept because even if you know the end of the story, you still cry at the sad parts. Hope for tomorrow doesn't stop today's tears. Let's pause again to reflect. Think for yourself. Do you beat yourself up for feeling sad? Yes, we know that God will ultimately put everything right in heaven, but still we weep right now.
Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home.
Even when we know how the story ends, we still cry at the sad parts. Then after the grace that reveals and the grace that feels, we see the grace that heals. When Jesus drove people out, drove out and overturned the tables in the temple. To understand this scene, we need to know a bit about the temple. Pilgrims would be traveling a long distance to get to the temple in Jerusalem, and they needed two things. First of all, they needed animals for sacrifice, and secondly, they needed coins that were acceptable for the temple tax. They couldn't be the Roman coins because it had Caesar's image on it. So animals were sold and coins were exchanged, and this began for very practical reasons. But by Jesus' time, commerce had taken over the sacred space and the prices were exploitative, the poor were disadvantaged, access to worship became financially controlled. What began as convenience turned into corruption. So Jesus restores what had become distorted. He heals what had become broken. But there's more to it than that. You see, the commercial activity took place in the large open area at the top of the steps. The way into the temple, there was these big steps. Then you go in through the temple, into the temple courts, and there was a big court there where all this trading took place. And that court was called the Court of the Gentiles. It was the furthest extent to which non-Jews were allowed to go into the temple complex. It was the place where Gentiles could approach God. But now they were being crowded out by the money changers and the merchants. So by clearing the tables, Jesus was not only standing against greed and corruption, he was also removing the obstacles that were in the way of the Gentiles. Jesus clears the space to restore the welcome for all people, a symbolic sign that God's house was for everyone. He restores God's original plan that his covenant was for all people in all places at all times. Right at the beginning of the Bible, God said that his blessing was for everyone. In Genesis 12, God promised Abraham, he said, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. God's blessing was never meant to be tribal or regional or national. It was for everyone. But sadly, the children of Israel had sometimes used their special place in God's plan to exclude others, particularly during the exile and under foreign occupation. Protection of their identity became the exclusion of others. The gift that was meant for the world became guarded as a possession. So when Jesus cleared the way for the Gentiles in the temple, he was re-establishing God's original plan of welcome for all people. He breaks the barriers that people installed. He restores the rightful welcome that God intended. And this grace that Jesus showed in reopening the way for all people contrasts with the ideas that there are winners and losers, insiders and outsiders. We are designed for community. As the Bible says in Galatians 6, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Life is not about lifting ourselves up by pushing other people down. It's about sharing together, drawing everybody forward, lifting everybody up. Let me close with a story I heard about a young girl with Down syndrome. We can learn so much from people with neurodevelopmental differences and indeed other forms of differences. I don't know if this particular story is true, but it certainly resonates with many stories of many people who have Down syndrome and people who know them. So in this story, the young girl, she struggled with lots of things in life, but one thing she loved was to run. And so she was delighted when she was invited to take part in a race for people with Down syndrome. When the starting pistol sounded, she ran with all her might together with all these other people, all with Down syndrome. But then she tripped and twisted her ankle. She fell heavily and winded herself. As she lay on the dust and gravel of the track, she not only felt the physical pain of her fall, she also felt the emotional pain of her failure. Through tear-filled eyes, she looked up, expecting to see everyone else cross at the finishing line without her. But they'd heard her fall, and they stopped running. The other runners walked back, picked her up, and helped her to the finishing line. They crossed it together because they knew that winning was not so important after all. What mattered was that they were together, supporting each other, caring for each other. That story echoes the graciousness we see in Jesus that opened the way for everyone to come to know him. This was never meant to be a world of winners and losers. It was meant to be a world in which we welcome and support each other. As we seek to wage grace in this community, let's recommit ourselves this Holy Week and through the year ahead to be a people who reveal Christ through our quiet humility and service, who feel the pain of those around us, and who heal through open arms, making room where others build barriers, opening the circle where others draw lines, walking together where others compete. Because the grace of Christ does not call us to push other people down. It calls us to belong together with God and with other people. God bless you.